Let's start with Warhammer Space Marine 2. Honestly, I had pretty high expectations going in, especially since I loved the first game, but this one really blew me away. I just finished it, and I'm still buzzing with adrenaline. If you're into anything Warhammer or just a fan of solid, brutal action games, this one hits all the right notes. Right from the start, I was hooked. You jump back into the boots of Captain Titus, and let me tell you, they've cranked everything up. Titus feels like an absolute force of nature, and the game really nails that power fantasy of being a space marine. Every time I smashed into a group of Tyranids, it felt like I was carving through them like a god of war. And these Tyranids are terrifying. The way they swarm you, it's a mix of pure chaos and strategic survival. Speaking of strategy, the game's combat is deeper than it looks at first. Sure, you can charge in swinging that chainsword and ripping through enemies, but you've got to think a bit too. You can't just button mash your way to victory, especially with those massive bosses. They've got these intricate patterns, so it feels like a dance between brute force and tactical moves. When I finally took down one of the bigger enemies after like 15 minutes of dodging and countering, it was such a satisfying moment. I felt like I earned that victory. And the story is more than just a mindless shooter, that's for sure. There are moments where the weight of war, the cost of being a space marine, really hit. Titus's arc feels more fleshed out this time around. He's not just a badass in power armor, but a character you actually care about. And the twist. I won't spoil anything, but there are moments that left me sitting there, mouth open like, did that really just happen? Honestly, it's the type of game where I'll be diving back in just to replay sections or try out different strategies. It's not just a one-and-done experience. If you're a Warhammer fan, you'll probably appreciate all of the little lore details tucked into the world. But even if you're new to it, Space Marine 2 stands on its own as a fantastic action game. Next, we have Resident Evil 4 Remake. You know how remakes can sometimes feel like just a polished-up version of the original? This one is so much more than that. Capcom managed to take one of the most beloved games in the series and elevate it in all the right ways. It's like they took everything that worked in 2005 and improved it without losing that magic. Honestly, if you're a fan of the original, you're going to be thrilled. First off, the graphics are stunning. You know how the original had that eerie, creepy vibe with its isolated village? Well, the remake takes that atmosphere to a whole new level. The foggy woods, the creepy lighting, it just feels so immersive. There were moments when I had to stop and just take in the environment. It's terrifying, but in a way that makes you want to explore every corner. Gameplay-wise, I was thrilled with how much smoother everything felt. Leon's movements are less stiff, and the gunplay, spot on. The combat has been reworked to feel more dynamic, especially when you're dodging and parrying enemies. Oh, and speaking of enemies, those Ganados are way more terrifying this time around. They're more aggressive, smarter, and honestly, I found myself sweating in some of those encounters, especially when you're dealing with hordes at once. I loved the tweaks they made to the characters too. Leon has more personality. He's still got those cheesy one-liners, but he feels more grounded. Ashley is no longer just the damsel in distress. She's actually helpful, and their dynamic adds to the story in a way that feels more natural. And don't even get me started on Luis, he's way more fleshed out. One thing that really struck me was how the horror element feels amped up, with some genuinely spooky moments. It's not all shootouts, there's a lot of tension building, and I caught myself holding my breath a few times. Overall, it's just such a satisfying experience. Capcom didn't just slap some HD textures on and call it a day. They rebuilt this thing from the ground up, and it shows in every detail. It's familiar but also exciting in a way that makes it feel new again. Next we have Mafia Definitive Edition. Alright, so I just finished this game and honestly I'm still processing how good it was. You know when a game just sticks with you? That's how this one feels. I've always had a soft spot for the original Mafia, but this remake? Wow, they really outdid themselves. It's like stepping into the 1930s for real. First off, the atmosphere. I don't know how they nailed the vibe of that era so perfectly. The city of Lost Heaven is just alive. Every little detail, from the cars to the buildings to the music, it really pulls you into that world. There were moments when I just wanted to drive around and take it all in, not even worrying about the mission at hand. Like, who knew 1930s radio stations would get me this hyped? And the story, it's not just a typical mobster narrative. You really get invested in Tommy Angelo's rise in the Salieri crime family. It's like playing through one of those classic gangster movies, but you're in control. I actually found myself sympathizing with him, which is wild considering, he's a criminal. But the voice acting, the facial expressions, it's all so believable. It draws you into the point where you care about these characters, even when they're making some seriously bad choices. Gameplay-wise, it's got that nice balance between action and story. Sure, there are shootouts and car chases, but I think what got me hooked was how well-paced it all felt. It doesn't rush you. The combat feels more polished this time around too. And the driving? I never thought I'd say this, but driving those old-school cars was actually fun. They're clunky, but in a way that adds to the immersion, if that makes sense. I also gotta say, I'm a sucker for good lighting in games. And this one? The lighting is incredible. Whether it's the neon lights reflecting off rain-soaked streets or the sun setting over the city, it's a feast for the eyes. I found myself just stopping to look at the skyline a few times. Weird, right? But that's how immersive the world feels. By the end, I actually felt a little sad to finish it. Next, we have Dragon's Dogma 2. After playing this game, I have to say it really exceeded my expectations. I mean, I was excited going in, sure, but once I actually got my hands on it, I realized just how much Capcom stepped up their game. Everything feels bigger, better, and more immersive than the first one. First off, the world is massive. I remember just wandering around for hours, not even on a quest, just exploring. The sense of adventure is so strong here. Every corner of the map feels like it has something interesting to uncover. Whether it's a hidden cave, a random group of enemies, or just a breathtaking view, you always feel like you're discovering something new. The combat, though, that's where the game shines. It's fast, fluid, and really customizable. I spent so much time tweaking my character's build, trying out different classes. One moment I was a nimble strider, darting around enemies, and the next I was a towering warrior smashing through everything. Every fight feels dynamic, especially with the new monster encounters. Those big hulking creatures, they're no joke. Climbing onto their backs mid-fight is such a rush. But what I loved most was the pawn system. They've really refined it. My pawn wasn't just a sidekick, they were essential. I grew so attached to them, seeing how they adapted to my playstyle. Sometimes I felt like they were learning faster than I was. It's cool to see your pawn in someone else's game too. I got some great items because other players were borrowing mine and leveling them up. The story is another thing. It's not just your typical hero's journey. There are twists, and the choices you make actually feel like they matter. By the time I reached the end, I realized the game had taken me on a pretty deep emotional journey. There's a lot of replay value too. I know I'm definitely going back to see how different decisions affect things. Honestly, if you were a fan of the first one, this sequel is everything you hoped for and more. And if you're new to the series, it's a great place to start. It's one of those games where you can get lost in the world and forget about time. Next we have Rise of the Tomb Raider. This game really took me by surprise in the best way possible. I mean, I knew going in it was going to be a solid game, but it actually exceeded my expectations on so many levels. First off, the environments are stunning. Every single location feels meticulously crafted, from the frozen Siberian mountains to the hidden tombs. You really feel like you're on this epic adventure with Lara. I found myself just stopping to take in the views at times, which isn't something I do often in action games. And speaking of action, the combat and stealth mechanics are incredibly satisfying. You get this perfect blend of intense firefights, sneaky takedowns, and crafting that just keeps you engaged throughout. There's this real sense of progression, too. By the end of the game, I felt like Lara had grown so much, not just as a character, but in terms of abilities. You can craft your own explosives, improve your gear, and upgrade your skills, so it feels like you're always evolving. The game nails that feeling of being alone in the wilderness. There were plenty of moments where I felt like Lara was up against impossible odds, but her resilience kept pushing her forward. There's something really inspiring about that. It's like you're constantly in survival mode, scavenging for resources, battling enemies, and fighting the elements. I have to say, the tombs themselves are a standout. They're optional, but trust me, they're worth exploring. Some of the puzzles had me scratching my head for a while, but that moment of solving them is so satisfying. I think one of my favorite parts, though, has to be the mix of exploration and action. It's not just a run-and-gun kind of game. There are these peaceful moments where you're just climbing, solving puzzles, or wandering through beautiful ancient ruins. Then, out of nowhere, the intensity ramps up with a firefight or a wild escape sequence, and you're on the edge of your seat. Overall, it's a fantastic follow-up to the rebooted Tomb Raider. I love how they've developed Lara into such a strong, determined character without making her feel invincible, but she's also someone you wouldn't want to mess with. Next, we have Dishonored 2. It's like stepping into a living painting where every corner has its own story. One of the things I really appreciated was how they expanded on the original game's mechanics. The new powers are incredibly fun to use. For instance, Emily's ability to manipulate time is a game changer. I found myself replaying levels just to experiment with different ways to use her powers. It's like the game gives you a playground for your creativity. Corvo's powers are just as thrilling as ever, but they've added a nice twist with his new abilities. The flexibility in gameplay is fantastic. Whether you prefer stealth or going in with all guns blazing, the game supports both playstyles seamlessly. It's amazing how each mission can be approached in so many different ways. I spent hours just replaying levels to see how different strategies panned out. The story itself, absolutely gripping. The dual perspectives of Emily and Corvo offer such a fresh take on the narrative. I loved seeing how their choices and actions impacted the world around them. It's impressive how the game manages to weave personal stories with broader political intrigue. Also, the character interactions were top-notch. It felt like the NPCs actually had a life of their own, reacting to your choices and changing their behavior accordingly. It made the world feel more dynamic and alive. I found myself genuinely invested in the characters and their fates. If I had to nitpick, there were a few bugs here and there, but nothing that really detracted from the overall experience. The developers have been pretty good about patching things up. Overall, Dishonored 2 is a fantastic follow-up to the original. It builds on what made the first game great, while introducing new elements that keep things fresh. If you loved the first game, you're going to be blown away by this one. And if you're new to the series, this is a great place to jump in. I definitely recommend giving it a try. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. Next, we have The Last of Us. Oh man, where do I even begin? You know how some games just stick with you long after you've finished them? That's exactly what The Last of Us did for me. It's so emotionally charged. Like, I knew it was going to be intense, but it's even more than I expected. Joel and Ellie's relationship? It's not just a typical protect the girl storyline. They feel like real people with real flaws. I think that's what I loved most, how raw and human it all feels. You watch them grow together in this messed up world, and it's not always pretty, but it's real. Speaking of the world, the post-apocalyptic setting is both terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Naughty Dog nailed that feeling of dread when you're walking through those overgrown cities. It's eerie, especially with the sound design. The clickers? Man, every time I heard them, my heart rate went up. And they're not even the worst part. The humans in this game? Sometimes, they're scarier than the infected. But honestly, it's the quieter moments that hit me the hardest. There's this one scene with Ellie in the giraffe sequence that made me just stop and take it in. In a world where everything's falling apart, there are still these tiny glimpses of beauty, you know? It makes you think about how people hold on to hope, even in the worst situations. Gameplay-wise, it's super tight. There's this constant balance of stealth, action, and scavenging, but what I appreciated most was how every encounter felt like it had stakes. You don't always have enough resources to just go guns blazing, so you've got to be smart about how you handle situations. And when you mess up, it feels real. Oops, that mistake might cost me my life here. By the time the credits rolled, I felt like I'd been on this emotional roller coaster. The ending? Oh man, I won't spoil anything, but let's just say it leaves you thinking. It's not a clear-cut, hero saves the day kind of thing. Complicated. And I love that about it. Life's messy, and this game doesn't shy away from that. If you haven't played it yet, I can't recommend it enough. Next, we have Evil West. If you're into games that let you feel like a total badass while fighting supernatural creatures, this one's for you. It's like Red Dead Redemption meets Van Helsing, but with way more punch. First off, the combat is brutal. You've got this mix of melee and ranged weapons that keeps things interesting the entire time. One moment, you're blasting vampires with a rifle, and the next, you're smashing them into pieces with an electrified gauntlet. The flow of switching between weapons and powers feels so natural. I loved how I never felt stuck using one method. The game just encourages you to get creative with the chaos. The story really surprised me too. I went in expecting just some fun, mindless action, but the narrative actually hooked me. You play as Jesse Rentier, this tough-as-nails cowboy working for a secret monster hunting institute, and the whole Wild West meets horror vibe is so well done. It's not Shakespeare, but it fits the tone perfectly. There's this balance of grit and humor in the dialogue that kept me engaged the whole way through. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's not just a throwaway plot either. I also love that they didn't overcomplicate things with RPG elements. There are upgrades, sure, but they don't slow down the action. You can upgrade your weapons and skills as you go, but it's straightforward and doesn't bog you down with too many choices. It's more about fine-tuning how you want to fight, which really lets you focus on the combat and the carnage. If I had to nitpick, some of the boss fights could be a bit repetitive, but honestly, when you're having this much fun wrecking hordes of monsters, it's hard to care. Plus, they keep throwing new enemies at you, so you always feel challenged, but not frustrated. Oh, and the co-op mode? Such a blast with a friend. It's rare to find a game where the multiplayer feels as solid as the single-player experience. There's nothing quite like teaming up and decimating a room full of demons together. All in all, Evil West is exactly what I needed. Next we have Watch Dogs 2. This one is so different from the first game, in a good way. I remember being kind of underwhelmed with the original Watch Dogs. Aiden Pierce, the protagonist, felt a bit too broody. And while the hacking mechanics were fun, the game just didn't have that spark. Watch Dogs 2, though? Completely different vibe. First of all, Marcus Holloway, the main character, is such a breath of fresh air. He's charismatic, funny, and feels like a real person you'd want to hang out with. And his crew? The whole DedSec team is just this cool group of misfits, and they have this energy that's contagious. You can tell they actually care about what they're doing, which makes all those missions feel more personal. Speaking of missions, the open world in San Francisco is incredible. It's not just bigger than the original, but way more vibrant. You know how some open world games feel like they're just there to fill space? Not here. There's always something cool happening. Whether it's a random NPC having a funny conversation, or some kind of crazy car chase happening right down the street. And let's talk about the hacking for a second. This time around, it's not just about pressing a button to hack a camera. You can control cars, drones, even giant construction cranes. There were so many moments where I just sat back and thought, I can actually do this in a game? It feels so rewarding to get creative with it. Like, I once completed a mission without stepping foot inside the building. I hacked everything remotely using my drone and RC car. One thing I wasn't expecting was how much I'd enjoy just exploring the city. There's so much to see and do. I remember spending hours just cruising around on my bike, taking in the scenery, the landmarks, the parks, the street art. It all feels alive. Plus, the random multiplayer events where other players can invade your game add this cool, unpredictable element. Sometimes I'd be minding my own business, then boom, another hacker shows up and it's on. Overall, Watch Dogs 2 is a huge step up from the original. Honestly, I kind of wish I could dive back in for the first time again. Next we have Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. I can honestly say, it's unlike anything I've played before. Right from the beginning, it sets a tone that's dark, emotional, and deeply immersive. You can tell it's more than just an action-adventure game. There's a deeper story here, and it pulls you in with every step Senua takes on her journey. The story is so emotional, especially as it deals with mental health in such a powerful way. The way they portray Senua's psychosis, the voices in her head, it's also unsettling but fascinating at the same time. It's like you're constantly living inside her mind, and that really makes you connect with her. It's rare to see a game tackle such a heavy topic with so much respect and depth. And then there's the combat. It's intense, but it's not over the top. It feels personal. Like every fight is a struggle for survival. You're not just slashing through enemies for the sake of it. Each battle feels like it has weight, like Senua's fighting for something bigger. And the way the game makes you feel isolated, with those stunning landscapes that somehow feel both beautiful and haunting, it just adds to the experience. The audio design really stood out to me too. Wearing headphones made a huge difference. The voices surround you, whispering in your ear, sometimes confusing you, sometimes guiding you. It's such a smart use of sound to mess with your mind, making you question what's real. Just like Senua, I found myself genuinely tense during certain moments. Not because of jump scares, but because of that constant feeling of unease. The puzzles were also a pleasant surprise. They're not your typical push this button, solve the problem kind of thing. They require you to pay attention to the environment, to see things from a different perspective, which fits so well with the themes of the game. I also have to say, Senua herself is an incredible character. The performance by the actress is just breathtaking. You can see every bit of her pain, her determination, and her fear in her eyes. It's one of those performances that makes you forget you're playing a game. By the end of it, I was emotionally drained,